Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Rocket Summer, yet another 4-star Michael K. Vaughan BookTube event that he created for the month of July to read classic science fiction. To read science fiction from its very earliest days, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, even Mary Shelley, to 1970, to the year 1970, which is the cutoff point for Rocket Summer. Preferably going decade by decade, preferably moving forward in a stately progression. But I have not been doing that. I've been bouncing all over the place. I have gone farther back in time this time around than I have so far, but I'm still nowhere near the beginnings of science fiction. I've gone back to the 1950s. I reread Hal Clement's classic Mission of Gravity that I found in this neat paperback that actually took a read really well. All these old paperbacks that I'm finding are holding up rather well. This is from the mid 1950s, and I read it in I think a Del Rey paperback. Didn't look anything like this a long time ago, and I've only read it that one time. So once again, I am using Rocket Summer as a reason, a pretext to reread a classic of science fiction that I ought to know better. I ought to know better than I do. And once again, the results are wonderful. Once again, Rocket Summer is turning out to be a fantastic event for me. Blessed, a lucky event for me, because this is so much better than I remembered it. I wonder if maybe one of the reasons that I groused about this book when I read it 40 years ago was that it has a lazy idiom as a title, which I absolutely hate. Mission of Gravity, Return to Sender, Case of Conscience, whatever the idiom is, unless you're using the idiom knowingly and ironically, then it has no business. Come up with a title for your book. Don't let somebody else do it. If you're using it ironically, okay, fine. I remember once, years and years and years ago, 30 years ago, I read a murder mystery that had the title "Do Not Fold, Spindle, or Mutilate," which was an old post office instruction for packages that would sometimes be stamped on them. Do not fold, spindle, or mutilate. They don't do that anymore. They don't do that. As far as I know, they don't stamp that warning on anything anymore. And of course, Gen Z would not know what spindle means. And the mystery itself was completely pedestrian. But there, I believe that the author knew, the author was in on the game of putting a standard phrase or idiom, a colloquialism, in the title, as the title. But that's a small thing to hang an objection to a book on, and I should have known better. I should have gone back to this. I'm recently become very interested in these classic science fiction authors who aren't remembered anymore. Certainly their B-list stuff is not read anymore. Maybe their one standout A-list thing. I think you could probably use that term for A.E. Van Vogt. Maybe not. You could certainly use it for Hal Clement. You could certainly use it for Jack Williamson, and a few other people that are on my mind lately for, I don't know, maybe Rocket Summer. But I went back to this remembering it fairly well. What I did not remember about it is how well it was done. This is a retrieval mission. It's a search and retrieval mission for a very, very valuable cargo on the planet Mesklin, which is, it's a weird torus disc-shaped world. Its gravitational responses, its gravitational effects are different than on a normal spheroid planet. And as a result, the gravitational forces are wildly inconsistent and brutally incompatible with humans. And it's humans who have lost this very valuable cargo on an area of Mesklin that they can't approach at all. There'd be no way for a human to operate even inside a craft in the area where this payload is and where it needs to be retrieved. So the human involved, the main human character, a guy named Lackland, contracts a freelance scrounger, scavenger, adventurer, a Mesklin native that you will get to do this kind of thing, whose name is Bar Lennon, and who is about a foot long, and who's centipedal in shape, carapace and pincers and whatnot. They manage to speak. There's no real discussion in this book about anything like Star Trek's universal translator or telepathy or anything like that. It's a mention is made. Bar Lennon makes mention of the fact that some of the higher registers of his own language aren't duplicatable by humans, but that he manages English fairly well. In fact, he learns it in no time at all. There's no fuss made about that. There's no fuss made about whether or not our characters can talk to each other. And there's also no fuss made about cultures. Bar Lennon, he is an alien, but he is, for the purposes of dealing with humans, he's essentially human. He acts like them, talks like them, and we know, because a large part of this book is the narration of his ship, the Bree, the narration of his crew. It doesn't have, a large part of this book doesn't have anything to do with humans at all, and we know that they are very like humans. Hal Clement just gave them a human culture, a human society. There are little differences here and there, but not really. Certainly nothing like the xeno-awareness, the trippy xeno-awareness that would arrive in science fiction only 2 decades after this book, so that you could no one would ever write a book like this. Now, no way. If you're a tiny centipedal creature on a gigantic, massively different world than Earth, it wouldn't just be the language that would be the barrier. You would be fundamentally alien in ways that Hal Clement is, when I first read this book, would have said isn't aware of. Now I know much better. I know not to be so condescending. It's that he's not interested in telling that story. He knows it perfectly well. This book is saturated with the planetary science of the day, with the physics of the day. Saturated with them. No way you can read this and think that the author just didn't think about what effect an alien culture would have. No, it's that it wasn't the story that he wanted to tell. Instead, there's a lot of, younger readers, Gen Z readers, the aforementioned Gen Z readers will snicker when I say there's a lot of hard science in here. Because they look at the 1950s and think, 1955, 1954, they think, well, what hard science was there? What did they know then? That was the prehistoric days. But it was only a few years after this book was published that Paleolithic science put men on the moon. Something that Gen Z has rather conspicuously failed to do. We'll start a turf war here. Just the point being, this is an extremely scientifically literate book. I learned a lot about how the shapes of planets, I relearned a lot about how the shapes of planets affects gravity on that world, and all the various curlicues involved, because on its way, Bar Lennon's way to effect this rescue, this retrieval mission, he encounters a lot of other kinds of aliens on Mesklin, all of whom are dealing with the weird physical dimensions of Mesklin in their own ways. And it's all fascinating. And it's so scrupulously written. I undersold this book completely when I read it the first time. Probably on one of those stereotypical long summer afternoons. I probably was in the wrong mind frame for it. Certainly I'm discovering that that's true with a lot of these Rocket Summer books. So I originally planned for Rocket Summer to read a whole bunch of cheesy, bug-eyed alien stuff. A whole bunch of those Ace Double novels that I got in the months leading up to Rocket Summer when I knew that Rocket Summer was coming. I did not at all anticipate that I would reread major works, that I would reread things that I thought I had settled years ago. I didn't expect that at all. I didn't expect Ringworld or Stranger in a Strange Land, and yet I'm doing it and I'm having a blast. This was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And deep. Boy, oh boy. I don't know if my number one reaction when I finished this night before last, my number one reaction was one that I don't think has much in the way of critical valence, which is, my number one reaction was, it's impossible to believe that this was written in the 1950s. It's impossible to believe that this was written 70 years ago. That just doesn't seem possible. If you read a mainstream piece of fiction, a mainstream novel from 70 years ago, you will bloody well know that it's from 70 years ago. You will bloody well know that it is. If you read a murder mystery from 70 years ago, you will certainly know that it's from 70 years ago. Nobody will have any effective use of forensics. There'll be an unbelievably blurry line between what a citizen can do to solve or interfere with a crime and what a member of law enforcement can do. If you read a romance novel from 70 years ago, good Lord, good Lord, it'll be like a different world. This, you don't know it at all. I finished this book and thought, that could have been written more or less today, except that today we are all about, thanks to the literary elements that are the reason we're cutting off Rocket Summer at 1970, thanks to the literary elements that come after that, we're all about the experiential side of science fiction now, and the imagine it from the inside out side of science fiction now. So you would never write a book like this now. You could write this story, but Bar Lenin would be completely different. Completely different. Lackland, maybe not so. Another prevalent theme in 21st century science fiction is that humans are the bad guys. Always. Even if it's unintentionally, but usually intentionally. And it doesn't take you long reading this book to know that although Lackland seems like a decent guy, the humans who are backing him want this retrieval to work. And they don't really care what they have to do to make it work. It's more nuanced than that. It's much, much more layered than that. I did not feel in any way condescended to. In a way that a 2024 version of this book would certainly condescend to me. Certainly it would. Because 2024, Gen Z, again, the much maligned Gen Z, a Gen Z writer of science fiction wouldn't feel that they need to explain why the white character, why the human character is a bad guy. They would feel like all they need to do is identify that it's a human, and probably a white human. They would feel that all they need to do is identify that that is the physical fact, and then their readership will go, okay. Like you've explained something. You haven't explained anything. You haven't given the character a motive at all. This would be a poorer story if it were done now. And that's amazing for me to think, because storytelling sophistication has only grown, by and large grown, in the last 70 years. Reader sophistication, especially for the specialized genres, has only grown in the last 70 years as those genres have balkanized and drifted further and further away from the exigencies of the mainstream. I automatically expect that most science fiction written today will be in many ways, especially the science fiction-y ways, better than science fiction that was written 70 years ago, probably on deadline, probably very hurriedly, on a manual typewriter with an open bottle of bourbon at your shin. Nothing wrong with those working conditions. I never used them myself. I used the manual typewriter sitting on a stool with me hunched over it, and I knew the feeling at the time of working for a deadline. So you'd better concentrate, because there's not going to be any revisions, and your name's going to be on it. And if it's really bad, it might have to be pulled, and you won't get paid. Despite the romantic illusions that are often purported about that old world of, the manual typewriter and the deadline and whatnot, the bourbon bottle was an enemy to that process, as was the bottle of wine. It was an enemy to that process. It's an enemy to that kind of crunch of concentration that you have to do on a manual typewriter, not only to type it correctly without a million redos, but also to make sure that it's relatively clean. A whole generation of hack writers had to learn how to write clean prose. Clean meaning it doesn't have any grammatical errors, it doesn't have any spelling errors, and it doesn't have any plot errors, so it doesn't need to be rewritten. I don't know the writing conditions under which Hal Clement wrote this book. I know that it's ranked all the time, as I've said with a few of my last Rocket Summer picks. It's usually on people's lists of great science fiction novels, and in this case, I agree. I loved it, just loved it. So my Rocket Summer is doing really well. I don't know what I will pick tonight. I had all those pulpy 35-cent paperbacks all lined up, and now all I feel like doing is revisiting the classics, provided they were written before 1970. That's a lot. That's a lot of books. That could easily carry me through Rocket Summer. So maybe that's what I'll do. I don't know. I'm certainly getting so much out of it that I wouldn't object if I had ended up doing that, as opposed to reading, an Edmund Hammond bug-eyed monster shoot 'em up, which I don't have any objection to that. I'd rather like Edmund Hammond and Captain Future, but this was a real book. Ringworld, for all of its prepossession with adventure, was a real book. Stranger in a Strange Land was a real book. I don't know. I'll figure it out. I'm being a little vague anyway. But that's your Captain Zog. Your report for today was Mission of Gravity. I don't really care how dumb the title is. I love the book. So Rocket Summer is still going fine for me, and I will report back on what tonight's reading is tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.